When my son was in middle school, he took up a time-intensive, high-concentration hobby. He started using our digital camera to make stop-motion videos. So frame by frame, he constructed short films of matchbox cars involved in scenes all around our home. They engaged in drag racing down the hallway, car chases across the floor and around the corner, and death-defying stunts straight off the edge of the dining room table. He did this by setting up the scene and then taking a picture, and then advancing the scene just a little bit and taking a picture, repeat, repeat. Eventually, at the end, he'd be able to flip through 100 or 200 pictures, and there would be a whole short movie unfolding in stop-motion sequence. This kid is now a film student at UNM, specializing in the automotive industry, I kid you not. Well, one day, I was transferring his photos from the digital camera into a computer, and something went wrong. I think I disconnected it before the transfer was complete. The technology was from the early 2000s, and it was not that great yet. So, with a poorly timed yank of one cable, I accidentally lost half of a 400 photo collection. They were deleted from the camera, and they were somehow not yet downloaded in the computer. Hours and hours of my son's work and creativity, and there was no way to retrieve them. I felt so terrible. My son has a gentle soul. He never was the kind of kid to throw fits or stomp his feet or anything like that. So when I broke this news to him, he received it with quiet affect. But I knew it was a big loss. He was probably about 11 years old. Would he forgive me? Later that night, I told him again how sorry I was. And in a sincere voice, he replied, "You should still feel guilty because I still feel bad." Oh, I loved this line. The parody of it, right? I feel bad, so you should feel guilty. Equity, justice. The offender will not be let off the hook. Who hasn't felt this way, right? When somebody has wronged them. That is so human. You want that instant karma, right? If somebody steals from you, it would be better to know that they are tormented by what they have done, that they are truly sorry. Instead, the universe is often like that little rhyme I've said before. The rain falls on the just and the unjust fella, but the unjust has the just's umbrella, right? The fact that the universe usually does not balance out wrongdoing or painful mistakes between people, at least not instantly, that is why we need the concept of forgiveness. If everything were automatically in balance, if everybody suffered from an amount of guilt equivalent to the harm they cause others, then we would not need forgiveness because everything would be even. Not only that, people would try a lot harder not to hurt each other, right? There would be no thoughtless words, no interpersonal violence. Our nation's entire economy would be dumped on its head. No longer would the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. All that excess wealth would cause a crushing feeling of guilt, equivalent to the suffering of being born in poverty. No one could stand it. But that's not how it goes. Sometimes a person does us harm, big or small, and they seem totally fine with it. And we are the ones left with negative feelings of disappointment and pain and suffering and sadness, anger or rage, and maybe other costs too to our bodies or to our lives. Or even if they apologize, we might feel it's still horrible what happened and unfair. The apology may not make things feel right or balanced again, and maybe we don't even believe their apology. It's as though the other person still owes us something. Maybe their debt is so big that nothing they could do would ever be able to set it right. To forgive is to let the debt go. It's to release a claim you have against somebody. It's to say, we are no longer bound to each other by what happened and by what remains unresolved. I release it, and in doing so, I release myself. Sometimes people speak of forgiveness as though it's a gift to the person who is being forgiven, and it certainly can be. It can be an undeserved gift, which is to say something that you could not be entitled to. The other person couldn't do anything to make them entitled to be forgiven. Of course, if you revel in how undeserving the other person is, you've probably undone some of the goodness in that, right? But if you do it well, you can forgive somebody in such a way that doesn't involve any sense of superiority, but leaves you feeling that a burden has just been lifted from you. And that's the burden of being angry. Where forgiving with a sense of condescension or superiority leaves you with a new negative way of thinking, forgiving freely is liberating, and it helps us to be at peace and well in ourselves. What's interesting is that the liberating, peace-giving effect of forgiveness on the forgiver is possible even if the other person never even knows they've been forgiven. It works even if that person has died. We can hold a claim against somebody who has been dead for years, and when we finally release it, we can still be set free. It opens up more space in us for gratitude, love, awe, joy. Releasing our claims against the past allows us to become more present to now and to what goodness is still unfolding. That's why there are so many forgiveness stories in sacred scriptures. In the Torah, there's the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Joseph's brothers band together against him one day, and they attack him. Then they sell him into slavery, and eventually he ends up as a slave in Egypt. But the powerful man who buys him takes a liking to Joseph, and Joseph ends up rising to power. Later, a famine drives his brothers into Egypt too, and they wind up right in front of Joseph, who now has the power to either help them or to kill them. In the end, he breaks down in tears and embraces them in unconditional love. The Quran also tells the story of Joseph in a similar way. In the Christian scriptures, Jesus tells the parable of the lost son. That's the story about a man who has two sons. One is helpful and responsible. The other one abandons his family and squanders all of his inheritance on what the scriptures call wild living. Broke and ashamed, he returns home in hopes of becoming just a servant in his family's household so that at least he'll be able to eat. But instead of humiliating him, his father fully celebrates his return, welcoming him back with open arms. A Hindu sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita, says, if you want to see the brave, look to those who return love for hatred. If you want to see the heroic, look to those who can forgive. And Buddhism, of course, with its teachings of compassion and non-attachment to negative feelings, has many stories about forgiveness. The Forgiveness Project is a wonderful website that contains reflections and stories about forgiveness. One of the things I appreciate most about it, actually, is that without any trace of judgment, it also contains stories of people who don't want to forgive, and stories of people who would love to forgive, but they just can't do it. It's too hard. And it has these stories along with many incredible stories of forgiveness taking place. That's just like life, right? Just like even right here in this sanctuary where we have people experiencing all those kinds of stories right now. Some will resolve, some may not, but we do what we can to try to achieve some peace and some equanimity in our lives. And church is a place where we can come just as we are, and we can find both resources and acceptance. One story on the Forgiveness Project was written by Marion Partington. In 1973, Marion's younger sister disappeared. 20 years later, her remains were discovered at last, and they were discovered along with the other victims of 2 serial killers who were a married couple. The husband took his own life after being found out, but the wife did not, and she ended up on trial all those years after Marion's sister's disappearance. And so Marion learned that she was going to be sitting in a courtroom face to face with one of her sister's killers. That year, Marion had started attending Buddhist retreats. While on one retreat before the trial, she made a vow. She vowed to forgive her sister's killers. She said it seemed like the most liberating, positive way forward, even though she had no idea how she was going to do it. She writes about what happened next. When I came home from the retreat, she says, I had an overwhelming, involuntary, and profoundly physical experience of murderous rage. It went whoosh from my belly all the way up to my skull. I wanted to scream, pull my hair out, claw at the ground. So for me, forgiveness began with murderous rage. Until then, I hadn't thought of myself as a murderous person, but at that moment, I was capable of killing. In other words, I was not separate from the people who killed my sister. She went on to learn that the woman had been the victim of tremendous violence as a child herself. And Marion decided she did not wish for the woman to experience any more pain. C.S. Lewis famously said, if we really want to learn how to forgive, perhaps we had better start with something easier than the Gestapo. But forgiveness does often begin with cultivating compassion in ourselves, even just a tiny bit. And this can be possible, as stories like Marion Partington's show, even in really terrible circumstances. Compassion might begin with a little curiosity. How did this person come to do what they did? Have they been broken by something larger than themselves? What does their behavior or their way of being cost them? Are they happy? Are they caught up in larger systems of oppression and violence? Do I have any personal experience with that kind of mindset? Is it possible that on some terrible level, they are doing the best they can? That's a tough question. And I'm not saying the answer to that question has to be yes, but it's a question that can open up our perception and might lead us in some important directions in our thinking once we stop finding it incredibly irritating, right? It's a really tough question. Are they doing the best they can? But it might become an important question. In the end, though, it's not actually necessary to believe the other person deserves to be forgiven. It's more important to believe that you deserve to be free of anger, resentment, and the desire for revenge. I like that quote by Anne Lamott. She says, "Not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die." Now, forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. It doesn't require speaking to the other party or, as I said, even that they still be alive. It doesn't mean being okay with what happened. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone continue to do harm. It's not weakness. We can forgive and still find it best to end a relationship. Forgiveness does not mean liking or agreeing with bad or even evil behavior. It does not mean becoming friends with someone who would continue to hurt you. And it certainly doesn't mean excusing them from any legal consequence there may be for their actions or from paying restitution. We can forgive and we can still expect the offender to face reasonable consequences, whatever those might be. To forgive is to say out loud or in our hearts, I'm not going to be angry anymore. It's saying, even though what you've done is bad, and it would be perfectly reasonable for me to stay angry with you for years. I am releasing this debt. To forgive is to acknowledge that it's too late to have a better past, but it's not too late to be present to what is and to experience liberation as we live in the present and look toward the future. When you forgive another person, you release the power their action has over you. The tension of that debt pulling on you is released, and you can get back to yourself, back to some peace, because the chains between you and that other person have been broken or removed. Studies have shown that this kind of peace has a physical effect on us, that it's actually good for our health. But what do we do when it's too hard? When the gap between where we're at and forgiveness is like a mile wide, right? What do you do then? Well, I think we can ask ourselves what it might look like to move just 1 inch closer. What would it look like to move just 1 inch closer today? Maybe it would look like sitting with those compassion questions, thinking about them without attachment to resolving them. Or maybe moving 1 inch closer looks different. Maybe it starts with you breathing and letting yourself just notice what it feels like in your body to carry that anger or resentment, to be still caught up in that debt relationship with this other party. And then you breathe and you visualize what it would be like to just have that lift off of you, what it would feel like in your head and shoulders and stomach. And that's the whole meditation, and that's the whole inch. Just noticing how you feel now and visualizing what it would be like to shed that and to just let it float away from you and be gone. Now, I haven't said very much yet about asking for forgiveness, except for that first story, or about learning to forgive ourselves, as Jane spoke of in her meditation. But I'm going to preach that sermon on a different day because I know we need it. Here in this room are people in need of forgiving and people in need of being forgiven, and if we're honest with ourselves, we know a lot of the time we are both people, right? I am, and you are. And the message of our universalist faith is that every one of us is forgivable. A big message. Every one of us is forgivable, and everyone is lovable. It's like our reading this morning in which Mary Oliver, the poet, says, "I am so distant from the hope of myself." We know what she means. We have felt that. I am so distant from the hope of myself in which I have goodness and discernment and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Goodness and discernment are big things to fail at. Yet the trees stirring around her remind her that she came into the world to go easy, to be filled with light and to shine. My hope for each of you and for all of us is that we'll experience forgiveness however we need it. May you give it and receive it as often as needed, even an inch at a time. May it be so. Amen. Will you rise?